Today I want to talk about a way we can simplify our subject and make it a little easier to paint. And that's trying to see our subject in more abstract terms instead of trying to be so literal. If we can break things down to just shape and value relationships, it becomes a little bit easier to render and paint on the canvas.
And we're talking about thinking abstractly about representational subjects. When we look at something, we tend to see things in terms of what they are: trees, leaves, branches, blades of grass. And we want to do several things. We want to simplify what we're looking at so we can compose it, but also simplify it so it just reads better. Too much detail kills a painting. And one of the better ways to do that is to think abstractly. And when you think abstractly, you simplify things. In other words, it makes it simpler to paint. Not easier, but simpler. It also helps us to compose better because you can always compose a painting better with large shapes than you can small details. So it helps us to simplify, see things easier, and compose. Easier to compose because you compose with large shapes, not details. And we tend to look at, especially for reason photographs, we tend to look at detail and we tend to think in terms of rendering objects separately. When we want to, again, you're composing a whole painting, so all the shapes have to pull together to create a pattern that works. And the best way to do that is abstractly. So when I'm looking at a painting like this is by Edward Pothast, a American Impressionist, early 20th century. You know, we see the rocks, we see the reflected light, the cracks and crevices. You know, it's all done very well, but when he starts the painting or comes up with the idea, he has to see it this way first, in terms of an abstract pattern of dark and light shapes on the rocks. Thinking in terms of the darks are going to dominate, the lights create a smaller pattern. And then he has a definite shape of lighter water and lighter sky. But how he composes this, how big he makes these shapes, and how much contrast is there is what carries the painting, not in, the real nice brushwork of the reflected light bouncing in the shadows, the cool violets and the warm gray oranges. I mean, all that's what we like about painting, but it's that simplifying of the shapes, seeing it not as rocks, but it's a dark pattern that helps set up the whole composition. And again, he's pulling all the darks in as one pattern. Even though there's several different values of darks, it's a pattern of darks that contrast the lighter shapes that make it work. So everything in the shadow becomes a pattern. And even some of the lighter darks become a pattern, as we'll see in some other paintings here. We're going to a Edward Redfield. Very simple painting, but still there's a strong contrast, and the contrast is important, not only just a pattern of shadow or dark, but the contrast of that pattern with the lighter areas of the painting. And again, abstractly, not necessarily clumps of snow and leaves and branches and rocks under the water, but in terms of pattern. And when you can see it this way, and you can do your thumbnail drawing, small 3 by 5 inch, whatever shape you want, but small thumbnail drawings of where you're picking up this dark pattern. And sometimes it includes darker lights too. If I have a stand of fir trees that are hitting the sunlight or that are in the sunlight, they're still going to read as a dark. Same thing here. Some of this is sunlit, but it all reads as a dark pattern that contrasts the lighter pattern of the snow. So it simplifies it. It sets up the composition, because you can't set up a composition with small brush strokes and details on the trees, and helps him simplify what he sees to be able to paint it more effectively. So again, we think in terms of how to render snow or render trees, but the first thing of importance is finding that pattern This is another Edward Redfield. And again, you notice right away the contrast of the shapes, the pattern of the value of the water, the value of the trees against the real light pattern of the snow. So always finding that contrast, and it doesn't have to be always a sunny day. It's cloudy day has patterns because you have different values in the planes of a landscape, and you use those to set up your pattern as well. So here we've got the dark pattern of the trees. I'm assuming it wasn't just randomly painted as you saw it, because it just sets up too well. It helps your eye. Starting here at the lower right, it just flows back all the way up to the upper left part of the canvas. And then the same thing also with the water. Definite pattern that flows into the pattern of the trees. So all those work together to set up that dark pattern, that contrast that sets up the composition. And only then is it feasible to render stuff. And he does a lot of rendering in shrubbery. But he has these big light areas that are flat, simplified, and that helps the dark pattern of the trees read a little better. And it's a good exercise, I think, to look at paintings and figure out what the artist is thinking in terms of composition. This is a George Gardner Simmons, also American Impressionist, about the same time as Redfield and Pothast. But here's that pattern that flows from the bottom of the painting, goes to the left, cuts over to the right, and to the top right. And again, it creates a composition that works. This is a big solid dark on the left side, but it's balanced by enough smaller darks on the right. You don't want equal balance, you don't want symmetry, equal weight on both sides, but a larger weight on one and a smaller weight that kind of balances it on both sides. But the darks are always somewhat connected. Starting here in the rocks in the bottom, they don't literally connect, but the viewer's eye connects them and it leads him up the dark pattern, and in this case here across the bridge to the right side, the shadow on the houses, shadow or a dark pattern of trees leading up to the hill in the background. And all that flows together to really create a composition that works. This is a George Innes, American tonalist, 19th century. But same thing here. And even though there's a lot of lights hitting a lot of sunlight hitting the tree, it's still part of the dark pattern because it contrasts the much lighter clouds and the much lighter flat plane of the landscape. So it's designed in such a way that it flows from the bottom left and goes right and goes up to the trees and then goes back left again and then comes back to the clouds, and everything somewhat connects and creates a large pattern that looks abstract, but it helps set up the representational feel of the painting. So rendering things, I think, as trees or grass or a flat plane or house is secondary to get the shape right that fits into the composition. And you have to think abstractly first to do that. This is a Russian Impressionist, Fyodor Zakharov. This is more mid-20th century. Starts out abstract and kind of stays abstract somewhat. The upper left is more representational, but a lot of just broken color, some brush strokes, short brush strokes of dark to lead your eye through that big light area on the bottom and lead you right up to the house and the two dark trees that are kind of the focal point. So figuring out the shadow pattern here, and your eye just flows up to this area where darkest darks, lightest lights. He simplifies the foreground. Not much contrast between dark and light. Some, but darks are kept pretty light. And that makes your eye flow right up to the dark darks and lightest lights, which is the house with the windows and the two dark trees and the blue sky. So, and your eye flows there with the shadow pattern. Everything kind of goes to the left, upper left, and really keeping the bottom part more abstract, not representational at all. Most of the painting itself is representational just in the upper left side. If I were to cut this stuff out on the right and at the bottom, it doesn't render anything, but it pulls your eye up to most of the detail up there. So again, think abstractly when you're setting up, you're composing, and you're trying to simplify what you see. Then maybe 3/4 through the painting, when you have all those big shapes, the right relationship value-wise and color-wise, then start thinking about rendering. But we tend to think rendering too soon. Our painting only gets tighter as we go. It never gets looser. So start very big, loose, abstract, and then render towards the end.
Now let's take a look at a few paintings that I've done. This one was in southern Utah, and I painted it outside. I always take a photograph of what I'm going to paint first. But when I saw this, what I liked right away was the strong light on the cottonwood trees with the darker background. And it's those abstracted shapes that the trees make when I see them as a group or a whole against the darker big shape of the shadowed mountains back there. What I don't want to see is, zooming in and counting the shrubbery in the background, or how many cottonwood trees do I have there. I might want to vary the shape a little bit more. When I'm looking at this, they're all a little bit the same height. So to come in here and then vary shape a little more, we get a little bit more variety of space between them, is always helpful. So I can redesign, but I still want to see things abstractly. I also don't see any need for this stuff in here. As a matter of fact, I don't think I painted the road at all. I think I jumped way ahead and just made the foreground into grass. Anyway, here's the painting. It's a 6x12. I have a small painting. But you can see, the more I can see abstractly, this becomes a lighter shape against the background. The background becomes a dark shape against the lighter sky. And then the cottonwoods are another lighter shape against the dark. So I'm playing off as much contrast as possible, because that makes a stronger painting when you can see those abstracted shapes and create more contrast between them. Now, I don't have much contrast between here and here. The trees are a little lighter, but I do have strong contrast with the background value against the lighter cottonwood trees. And I'm seeing those trees just as simple shapes and masses. I'm not trying to render foliage or individual leaves even. And very little to do with the trunks. It's more about the shape. And abstracting them means I can think of them more as a shape as opposed to trees and foliage and branches. It just makes it easier to think about. Looking at a good abstract painting can help you see that the subject matter, while it is important to me, I do like the subject matter. That's what motivates me to paint. But if at first, at least, I can see it more abstractly, the better. So here we have the lighter abstract shape of the fall foliage. It's kind of sparse, but I don't have to paint it sparse. I could make it a little bit thicker mass, which is a little easier to paint than a bunch of little dots of yellow, orange. Then I have the darker background shape and the kind of middle ground or middle value of the sky. That's going to make the lighter foliage stands out. If I get the sky too light, the foliage won't stand out. But abstracting those shapes, the foliage, not trying to copy it exactly, but create shapes in there will help. And then the vertical aspen tree trunks help break it out or break it up. And I want to arrange them a little bit differently. I think one or two more over here. And I don't know, 30 tree trunks there, I might paint 6 or 7. So simplifying the shapes makes it easier also. And here's the painting. Put a figure on a horse with some sheep in it. I guess I do have more than 5 or 6 tree trunks, but balanced it off with one over here for this mass of lighter tree trunks. But the tree trunks break up the shape of the foliage and the shape of the background and sky, and figures add a bit of interest to it. But I'm not worried, again, about the foliage in the sense of individual leaves. It's more about the massing of them together. Photograph is a lot more sparse, a little bit more busy. By pulling the shapes of the foliage together, I get it less busy. Really, the only busyness is in the grass in the foreground, which the busyness makes the foreground come forward more, and the simplicity of the background stuff makes it recede. Now, this is in southern Utah, Capitol Reef National Park, and the sun was kind of coming and going. I want to see this in terms of a shape. If I can, again, see the foliage on these trees as a shape and where it fits in with the shape of the water shape of the ground here, shape of that sunlit hill, shape of the background. About 6, 7 big shapes. The more I can see them as just a shape instead of trees and grass and rocks, the easier it is to compose. Seeing things abstractly may not help as much with finishing a painting, but I think it helps you finish off the most important part, which is compose. Because it's much easier to compose with big, simple, abstracted shapes than it is with seeing, 40 branches on this tree and hundreds of little dots of leaves. Same thing with the rocks. Force things into abstract shapes to make it easier. Now here's my painting. A lot more color, pushed a bit more sunlight and added the deer into the background. But seeing this at first as just a light yellow-orange shape, simplifying the tree trunks and branches, and seeing the bank on either side of the river as a simple dark and light shape. And I can break those shapes up into smaller darks and lights, but keep things very, very simple and very abstracted. Again, if I have the horizon line too high in the middle, then I'm just breaking the canvas in half, and it's not as pleasing to look at, but having it lower down in here and then breaking up the top into 2 or 3 big masses or shapes. Same thing with down below, light and dark on each bank, and then the shape of the river. And I think finish is something, learning to finish or add detail to a painting kind of comes when the beginning stuff becomes more easier. It kind of develops naturally rather than trying to learn a technique and try and place a technique on top of a bad composition. So learn to compose, learn to see your values first, compose with big, simple shapes. Then I think finish or detail comes a lot easier. Here's one in also southern Utah. And again, thinking abstractly, I've got the big dark here in the foreground, and then the light shape of the rocks, and then the light shape of the middle ground, foreground, and then the sky. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 big masses or shapes that I can compose. And much easier to compose with bigger shapes and just a handful of them rather than 10 or 20 or 30 small little shapes. And 10 or 12 values. If I can see things in terms of 2 to 3 values, at least or 2 values in each of the big shapes, much easier to compose. And again, the detail is something that doesn't always make your painting better. It might finish it a little bit, but more detail doesn't necessarily finish a painting. So here, after abstracting the shapes, I can make sure these values and shapes and the rocks hold together better. Same thing with middle ground and the foreground. And I don't let myself think in terms of shrubbery and detail until the very last part of the painting. It's making things hold together while they're bigger, simpler shapes that it's going to make the painting work. Helps to look at abstract paintings, good ones, but learn to try and see things in big, simple masses before we think about detail and reality.